Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Welcome again to the Canadian Symposium for Parental Alienation Syndrome. To start this evening's program, I'd like to introduce again one of our speakers, Dr. Terence Campbell. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Bone. Dr. Bone has worked in the area of parental alienation and high conflict divorce for the last 2 decades. He has served on the Scientific and Professional Advisory Board of the Parental Alienation Research Foundation in Washington, D.C., along with the late Dr. Gardner, Randy Rand, and Deirdre Rand. Dr. Bone provides both mental health and legal continuing education training to lawyers and mental health professionals regarding parental alienation in multiple states. He serves as a court-appointed evaluator, therapist, and expert witness in numerous cases involving parental alienation and makes recommendations to courts around the country. And I assume, as I am, you are looking forward to Dr. Bone's comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks for coming back, too. It's probably kind of a challenge at this hour and after dinner and so forth, so hopefully this will be of value to you. What I want to do, obviously, tonight, by the obvious title, is talk about treatment, but I want to talk about it in a particular, in a kind of in a way that creates a model that hopefully will be useful to measure various different treatment strategies that may be proposed by the court. The court's notorious for making recommendations, then many of which don't work at all, and being able to identify which ones are more likely. So this is my little overture here. The first part of what I want to talk about is the fact that us humans are biased and biasing creatures. Our entire sensorium, the way we symbolize things, the way we record things in our memory, are prone to violence, to bias. I think I'm tired. I don't know. That must mean something. I like to say that we like to think that there's a level playing field, but there really isn't. We're all sort of on the slippery slope, thinking we know what's going on when really there's a swirl of bias around us all the time. I think that's important to recognize. So I'll address that in certain ways in just a moment. Then I want to talk for a moment about parental alienation and the phenomenon of alienation and how it's applied as we know it now since 1985 and what's happened to it and what's happening to it in terms of how we think about it, a little historical perspective. And then I'll talk about this a little bit because I think Pamela and Bob Hoke are going to be talking about this in specific terms in the program they have, so I'm anxious to hear about that. And then finally, if I can pull all this off, to try to figure out what works. Because we know there are a great many things that don't, so we're going to try to carve out the parts that hopefully do. I'm not sure what prompted Born to Bias. Bruce Springsteen or something, I think, I don't know. The first layer, I want to sort of talk about bias and how we are that way as humans, kind of working from the inside out. The first part being the neuroscience of it, the human brain. If you really look into the neuroscience of the brain and how the brain works, we find out that the systems within the brain are all biasing, balance, counterbalance processes that are constantly at work in an effort to keep us homeostatic, but we're easily tilted off balance. And that's just how the gyros work in our brains. One little example, there's a thing in the brain near the brainstem called the amygdala. The amygdala is a concentration of neurons that really is responsible for the fight and flight response. Fight, anger, hatred, flight, fear, terror, parental alienation. I mean, the amygdala gets a workout in parental alienation cases, and we'll talk about how that does work. But in the case of the amygdala, which is in that lower part of the brain, there's also a counterbalancing part called the orbital medial prefrontal cortex, otherwise known as the ORMFCP or something. I can't remember that exactly. But anyway, that's in the front of the brain that takes the signals of what's going on in the case of alarm with the amygdala and determines if, in fact, there is danger. So there's this balancing process. So if it's determined that something, there's a start and we get frightened by something, and then we determine, oh, no, that's okay, that's fine, then that other part of our brain counters it and sort of dies it down. If that doesn't happen, then the amygdala takes off and our ability to have rational thought is greatly diminished. Okay? So think about fear. Think about fear, and if fear is a thing that is real, but is the object of fear real? That's the question I think that's important when we talk about treatment for alienated kids. Is there a real thing to be fearful of? And that's what we have to think about. When I was, I think, 4 or 5 years old, my parents moved from one house to the other, and I got my own bedroom. I didn't have to share with my brother anymore, thank God. And I remember the first night, I don't know if it was the first night, I may have reconstructed this or made it up, I'm not sure, but I believe this really happened. When the light was turned off, there was a lamp that was situated by the window. And as I would look at that as a 4 or 5 year old little boy, that thing looked exactly like a gorilla. Now I knew that gorillas were not indigenous to Florida. And I couldn't figure out how that one got there, but I knew there was one there in my bedroom. So I stealthily crawled across the floor, got to the light, turned the switch on, and saw it was the lamp. And then I told my parents about it, and I noticed a few times the next nights or the next near future, whenever that was, if I were to wake up in the middle of the night, there's the gorilla back again. Then my amygdala fires, I go, whoa, and then the other part of my brain began to say, oh, that's just a lamp. That's not really. So I was able to calm myself down. You can see the counterbalancing process that's just kind of normal. Now, what if instead of me turning on the light, I went into my parents' room and said, there's a gorilla in my room, and they knew it was really the lamp. But instead of saying, oh, it's just the lamp, what if they took the lamp out and pretended, oh, well, oh my God, this is terrible. You know, let's keep the lamp in the other room. Now, what would that have done to me and my experience of that whole thing? Yeah, it would have embedded that as an experience, and it would have encoded that as an experience that I would later then record in my memory. So in the sense on a neuropsychological level, in terms of brain function, in terms of neurotransmitters and how the different parts of the brain work, it really is a balancing act constantly. But if things are unbalanced and they're kept that way and they're not able to right itself, it can create a real destabilization. And there's evidence now that shows that if there's a lot of trauma early on in developmental periods, that the trauma to the brain develops differently. Children that have are victims of abuse and neglect are much more destabilized in terms of being able to find homeostasis. They're more anxious than other kids. So the structures of the brain actually grow differently because of it. I mean, the boundary between what's organic and what's experiential really doesn't exist. I mean, there is a free flow back and forth. So that's one part of the bias process. We're easily biased, is I guess the point I want to make. Now, us humans are storytelling creatures. We really exist by stories. In pre-literate societies, the vast majority of human experience, it's all cast down in the oral tradition in the form of stories and so forth. Once we developed literacy, it got written down, so we could start looking things up then where we couldn't before. But nonetheless, they were still stories. And language is not just simply a description of reality. Language actually impacts and creates reality. I remember a series of studies I came across in about 1970, a long time ago, where there were bilingual families in Washington, D.C. that were English and French speakers, and they were given 2 sets of psychological tests. One in French and one in English. And the results of the tests were they really had rather different personalities, whether they were speaking in French or speaking in English. And that was sort of startling, I think, because English and French are fairly closely related languages. So the next thing they did was compare English speakers to Japanese speakers. And not only were they different personalities, they were like different people. I mean, so the impact of language and how we symbolize things really determines how we experience things and how we'll get to memory in just a moment. So when a child is told a story about a parent, or a parent reacts with undue alarm when there's some ambiguous thing that's going on, rather than saying, oh, I'm sure it'll be all right, it's fine. I'm sure your mom or your dad didn't mean anything by that, which would be the proper response. Instead, they go, oh my God. They did what? And then what after that? Amygdala fires, it gets encoded, then the child describes the experience with language, and then it becomes something that is a real event that becomes evidence from the research of Stephen Ceci about the interview techniques of children that are going to testify in court have shown that it dramatically affects the outcome of what a child will say depending how they're interviewed. I mean, basically, if you ask a child, a pre-adolescent child especially, the same question twice, they'll give you two different answers because they think they got it wrong the first time. And I've seen many, many videotapes of children being interviewed about whether they were abused, and if the interviewer was not very sensitive to that, and most really are not at all sensitive to that, then they really want to get a conviction. They will start, boy, what do you mean? Are you sure? You sure you're not lying to me? And they'll start focusing attention, and the child will relent and go, well, maybe, I don't know. So we see the way that language interacts like that then begins to actually convince a child that things that happened that didn't really happen. There was a case I was involved in South Florida a number of years ago where a child had been erroneously put into a treatment situation for children who had been sexually molested. Now keep in mind, in this case, this child never accused anybody of doing anything. It was a 12-year-old girl who parents were going through a divorce, and the father was taking the child to school, and he said, and put his hand on her knee as she was getting out of the car and said, honey, you look really pretty today. When the girl got home, that was it. When the girl got home, her mother went through a whole battery of questions about how was your father's last night and what happened, and oh, Dad said I look pretty. What do you mean? He said, and start the whole alarm reaction to that. The child began to experience, oh my God, something terrible happened. Well, that child was put into treatment, group treatment for victims of sexual molestation, and last I heard to this day, she believes she was the victim of sexual molestation. That's just language. I mean, she learned to talk about it differently and began to believe it. If you think about it, psychotherapy is really all about language. It's about learning to talk about yourself differently. I remember a study I read many years ago, and I wish I could find it, but I can't, but I promise you I really did read it. It was a linguistic study of people in psychotherapy. I got a real kick out of this. A linguist studied the language patterns of people the longer they're in therapy. What they basically found out is that the longer somebody's in therapy, the more they talk about themselves like their therapist talks about them. And we call that insight. I mean, what's really happening, there's a transfer of information going on, but the more effective, the less apparent that is. Language in action changes the symbolization of things. How stories are coined, that determines the reality of things. Think about what happens when children, or during an evaluation process, and a child is asked all kinds of questions about things that happened. Now, if the evaluator's been told things by the parent about a particular incident, and they're going to think, well, something may have happened here, so they're going to ask a few more probing questions, and as the child describes it, it becomes more real. So the way language works, depending on the context, which may be momentary, it may be instantaneous, but under the right circumstances, it can become permanent and create, again, that sense of bias. So language is very, very biasing. So we're wired that way, we symbolize that way, and here's the next problem. Memory. There is a great book I would recommend by a Harvard psychologist by the name of Daniel Schachter. It's called The 7 Sins of Memory. What that basically is, the 7 sins are the systemic problems of incorrect memory, source misattribution and things such as that were mentioned, I think, yesterday, as a matter of fact. it's easy to think about, if I say, well, imagine something tomorrow, it's easy to see that as being a construct, isn't it? Well, I'm going to make that up. And so there's a fantasy of what things are going to be like tomorrow. In the case of memory, it's really more correct to think of memory not as a recording of past events, but as a retrograde construct of the past, very much impacted by emotion, is very arbitrarily anchored to a particular vision or a particular symbolization of something. So memory is really squirrely as far as if you have 10 people experience the same thing. I'm sure you've all experienced this. And then, or if you had a family reunion and all the extended families together and you're talking about something that happened when we were kids 20 years ago and you talk about the same event, you all were there, but my God, it was all different. Nobody remembers it quite like that at all. When I was in college, I had the good fortune of going to school in England for a while, and I made it my business to go to Paris a few times, a lot actually. And I got to feel like I really knew Paris pretty well for a 20-something-year-old. And then many years later, I got married and went to a honeymoon to Paris, and I thought, I am the Paris guy. I remembered it exactly the way it was, right down to the Champs de whatever. And as soon as we got there, I was completely lost. It was raining. It was kind of a funny story. It was raining, and my wife said she's going to go to sleep. And I said, well, I'm going to go find us some umbrellas. I got lost and couldn't find the hotel. It took like an hour before I found dripping wet. But anyway, it was based on my incorrect memory of what I remembered Paris being like. It was nothing like that. But I had encoded that memory in a way that was, you hooked me up to a polygraph, and it was true, 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 no question about it. But I was just wrong, wrong, wrong. So that, and I don't think I have a memory impairment, nor do I think I have a language impairment or a neurological impairment. We all are pretty squirrely when it comes to being about bias. We get things more subjectively than probably any of us can grasp. And really, so what do you do about that? That's the punchline to come a little bit later. So what I want you to just think about is we are creatures that are born to bias, I guess, and of bias. And that's what we do, and that's how we process reality and so forth. So as we talk about events that happen, we've all had the experience of watching something happen and have 10 people describe what it was, and you get 10 different versions of it. I mean, that's pretty standard. So let's take what we know about bias and our proclivity towards it and look at the issue of parental alienation. Specifically, not maybe parental alienation, but just alienation. By that I mean politicization. I read somewhere that if you have 3 people, you have a political situation. The idea of 2 people aligning against a third person, I mean, that's triangulation, as we know in family systems kinds of things. There's reality TV shows like Survivor that are based on alliances and divisions and things like that. It's part of human nature. If we go back in history, I mean, think about Shakespeare. Think about opera. Think about some of the great works of art have to do with alliances and intrigue and saying something about somebody else that isn't true. And then the effect that has on the whole outcome of the event. I'm sure you've all had the experience at one time or another of being told something very negative about someone you've not met yet. And then immediately meeting them, and immediately you're a little bit suspicious. And you don't react kind of the same way. What's interesting is that if you were told something positive about that person, the memory would not be as embedded. Amygdala, danger. In 1919, Freud wrote a book called The Problem of Anxiety. And it's probably one of the things that Freud wrote that still hadn't been too dismantled, I think. He basically said that anxiety is a signal of danger. It's a way that we have to survive. It's why us creatures, us human beings, when we began to evolve from prehistoric times, we were not the strongest cat out there at all. But we had these brains that could do this stuff. So we were able to survive and come up with strategies that would be effective for our survival, and here we all are. The survival mechanism, the ability to be alert and to keep us alive is the kind of thing that happens in these cases in prehistory, as we see, and it goes back, it's just part of human nature, really, I think. And I think I put that there, yes it is. That again, we are biased individuals, but also how we interact with others is also kind of equally biasing. It's very easy to see those kinds of complaint behaviors happen all the time. What's water cooler behavior like in most offices? Is it positive? Is it telling how great it is to be there? And it was so nice to come to work, and boy, they really did my schedule just right. No, it's not. It's about how it's unfair, how so-and-so got screwed, how so-and-so, all things like that. It creates, there is a bias towards that, survival and so forth. I'm not sure it's what that says about us, but it's just, it is what it is. So this tendency to have this tendency to bias really is supported linguistically, neurologically, and through our memory. So it is who we are. So perhaps it shouldn't be that surprising that when you apply pressure amongst to these particular parts of what it is to be human in the context of divorce with children, that it's really going to be an overwhelming kind of experience. Richard Gardner, that we've heard a lot about Dr. Gardner. By the time he wrote the article, well, he's a clinical professor at Columbia, a very well-published person, very successful, really world-renowned before he ever wrote the article in 1985. He had invented the mutual storytelling therapeutic technique for children. It was rated as one of the great contributions to play therapy, the way it's supposed to be done, you know, and he also was the first to come up with board games that are used therapeutically with children. Now that's standard issue. I think his work was translated in 9 languages, you know, published 40 books, 130 or so peer-reviewed articles, a very well established, successful psychiatrist. Then he began to notice in the late 70s there was something strange going on with divorce. Kids were now suddenly saying they hated a parent when there was evidence that they had a loving relationship before that. And that's when he wrote the first article in 1985, where he said children can be induced to lie. They can be induced to lie about whether they had been sexually molested. And as a consequence of that, he became really a target. I believe the 85 article, as I recall, is the one where he coined the term parental alienation syndrome. If it wasn't that, it was pretty soon thereafter. But when he called it that, he was really describing a cluster of symptoms, as we've seen, and I'll touch on real quickly. I didn't know that was right there. But here it is, the cluster of symptoms that Amy Baker did a terrific job on last night, so I won't add to that other than just the moment it takes to push the button all these 8 times. If there's any questions about any of these, don't hesitate to ask. I'll be glad to. But these are the things. I think what's interesting about this, he called this a syndrome. He said this was a pattern that would develop over and over and over again. When Amy Baker wrote her book before it was published, I had a chance to have a look at the manuscript, and I read the thing, and I called her and I said, let me get this straight. Let me make sure I'm understanding what you're saying. Are you saying that what your research shows, that it pretty much validates what Richard Gardner said? And she said, that's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, that's what happened by self-report. So, and the pattern of this is kind of amazing. I mean, it's a tightly organized phenomenon where people have some of the symptoms and then it progresses into more severe. In that sense, it can be very well predicted. Now, the fact that there have not been placebo-controlled, I don't know how you do that, double-blind studies of these things, I mean, we'll figure all that out. I think right now the research that Dr. Baker has done is a good start towards that. But I think the self-report we're getting of adults who had experienced this in childhood is really very, very compelling. So I look forward to that carrying more weight. He basically said, and I think this is the point and the thing that was going to get everything kind of stirred up as we go forward. He said the necessary ingredient, I'm not sure he said these exact words, this is what I take it to mean, but I think it's pretty consistent if you read his stuff. The necessary ingredient to create parental alienation syndrome is the alienating behavior of the favored or alienating parent. Okay? Now, he also said that parental flaws of a targeted parent could influence it, could make it worse, an easier target if somebody's not a very effective parent, no question. But, and here's the question, would those flaws, that imperfect parenting that we all have experienced if we're parents, and we've all done it, would that be adequate, sufficient to create this reaction in a child? And I think we've seen in many of the papers presented here this weekend that the answer is a resounding no. I mean, the reaction that children have when their parents are far from perfect, even abusive, is not to reject them. And I kind of, Brian Ludmer talked earlier about the questioning the notion of realistic estrangement. I think that's worth looking into, because when you really look into it with this in mind, I think you're going to see ingredients very likely of the other parent influencing. It's very powerful. And if a child feels that they're in the middle, they will take sides. They will do, what's the right answer? Just tell me what to say. If you do, anybody that's done custody evaluations with families where alienation is not present, I believe if you ask the question, how hard is it to get a kid to say something negative about a parent? I mean, you wouldn't say it like that, of course. But it is very difficult. Children are protective. They want to keep their heads down. They don't want to be in the middle of this. They do the opposite of what these alienated kids do, where the alienated kids come in with a banner and try to convince you that this is the worst person that ever was. So I think it's important to realize that the reaction that alienating children have, their behaviors, are really fundamentally unnatural. That's the kind of the word I like to use, because I think it is. It doesn't come out of the relationship with that parent, but rather it has to do with an assault from the outside. And I think that's the bias, and I think children are very, very vulnerable to that from their own parents. It's been said in different ways in earlier presentations that you know, think back when you were a kid and when your parents told you something, did you basically think it was true, or did you go, what do you base that on, when you're like 8 years old? No, it just doesn't work that way. So, you know, children are very vulnerable. I mean, there are lots of studies that show that adults are vulnerable too, even to stranger. I mean, think about World War II, think about the Khmer Rouge, think about all the other atrocities that have happened historically. And then we see that bias is not our strong, suit. That's something that we're very, very vulnerable to. So I think it's important to understand that to boil all this down, Richard Gardner was saying this is the necessary ingredient. You cannot have those 8 symptoms, those 8 behaviors without that. I had a parent describe, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll save that for a little bit later. Here you have Richard Gardner writing an article in 1985 describing this stuff, and it's now getting so it's becoming more common. More and more people are seeing it. Began to describe solutions that sometimes meant custodial change, not always. I think it's important to recognize that depending on the degree of alienation, the intervention is different. Everybody doesn't get a custodial change. It has to have other ingredients too. It's not one size fits all. But it is that one size does fit all, recognizing the ingredient to that is the alienating parent's behavior. But the reaction to this, after this went on for a while, and now these are alienating parents are having the fingers pointed to them. Okay? Now these are people that have a high incidence of personality disorders. How do people with personality disorders take to being blamed for anything? Well, no, they don't do that. But they will fire back. So as a consequence, they fire back, and that's what started to happen. So it was the whole PAS argument, we've talked about this before, so I'll just touch on this, portrayed then as a shield for abuse, that there really is abuse going on. Many people in the literature have pointed out that when there is abuse going on, that this is not appropriate, this is not what this is. It's another phenomenon entirely, but it nonetheless gets portrayed that way. It's portrayed as the cure is worse than the illness. The removal, if there is a change of custody that is indicated, it's abusive, or the word often used is draconian. I hear that all the time. That seems to be sort of in favor. I've also heard this be that people involved in this work are portrayed as cult members. That was a new one, but many of us have been portrayed as cult members. But again, that's the reaction from the fact that it's been identified as this is the key ingredient to creating the alienation phenomenon. And also, the people that identify this become targets. Dr. Sauber mentioned that. A few other people have mentioned that, and that's very real. So that's a whole other phenomenon. As a consequence, you see fewer and fewer evaluators willing to do evaluations. And that's really, I think, kind of goes with the turf. So, as it's been mentioned, the divorce industry, rightly, wrongly, good, bad, whatever, is a big industry. So with all this stuff going on since 1985, and this reaction that we just saw, and the list of all those things, and there are many others, I'm sure, what do you think's going to happen? Somebody's going to go, we need to look at this again. Well, it turns out there's a group of people in Marin County. Their names you'll hear all the time. Janet Johnston, Judith Wallerstein, Joan Kelly. Those are, there are other names, but those are important names that we see over and over and over again. Judith Wallerstein and Joan Kelly did some of the original longitudinal work of the effects of divorce on children. It's really good stuff. It was, I think, 60 families, I believe it was, and 131 children, and they followed them from, I think, the 70 through for a 10-year period and a 25-year period, and drew conclusions for that were written in 2 books that were published by Judith Wallerstein. I think it's important to understand, however, that the people that participated in this study were volunteers. They were from a non-clinical population. They were self-selected, and they were given therapy for participating in the study. And I don't think that part's a big deal, but the fact that they were a non-clinical population, they didn't have diagnoses per se. They didn't come from some mental health center or something or some other referral source. And they were also upwardly mobile, upper middle class, professional type families and so forth. Not the typical, it's a specific demographic that we're seeing in this study. The Judith Wallerstein's conclusions about parental alienation really are based on the 26 kids out of that 131 kids that were identified as having some issue with parental alienation. And they weren't badly alienated, leading her to conclude that, well, I don't think really intervention is necessary, because they sort of hook up later on. Instead, she focused on how intrusive visitation was, and how one little girl, when she reached the age of 18, decided to stop seeing her father because it was so intrusive to have her schedule interrupted for the visitation. I don't know, to me that sounds like alienation, but it didn't according to the way that she was looking at it. But anyway, they worked together. And then Joan Kelly, they sort of went their separate ways amicably. I think they had different interests. And she established the Northern California Mediation Center. Mediation was being explored as an alternative way to avoid litigation and so forth, so that she was very interested in that. But in the process of that, noticed that some people just couldn't mediate. That launched the Divorce and Mediation Research Project, which really sought to study that, about what in the world was going on, and that sort of led to conclusions about there were some people that Joan Kelly believed really were sort of formed an unholy alliance between the parent and an enmeshed parent and a child. And that's what she referred to in that work. Janet Johnston, meanwhile, the director, I think she was the Center for Families in Transition, also in Marin County, that same area, basically set out to develop a self-appointed task force to study Gardner stuff. And there's anecdotal stories here that I probably won't tell you about maybe some of the motivations for some of these changes that may have happened. Basically, the reformulators these are the people that were sought, and these are very well qualified people. These are good solid clinicians who are well studied and educated and very well experienced and so forth. But they began to look at this whole thing. Their main criticism was they felt it was simplistic, that Gardner was making it too cause and effect. It was more, we saw there was a presentation from a systems point of view that it needs to be more circular or triangular as opposed to one-way causality. Reasonable concerns. But they came up with a kind of a reformulation. And in 2001, in the Family Court Review, there was a special issue of that was published. The Family Court Review is the official publication of the AFCC, which is the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, which is hard to say. I don't know why I don't know who came up with that name, but the purpose of this issue was to address that and the results of all this, the work that this group had been doing. And they basically reformulated the model. They changed it, and they basically went from the PAS model, as they referred to as Gardner's PAS, to what they call the alienated child. Now think about that with language. PAS, parental alienation. Now we're focusing on alienated child. The parent part of that goes away, doesn't it? Now it's just the focus on the child. Okay, fine. They said also that it wasn't, Janet Johnson especially tended to say that really it's not the alienating parent, it's sort of they're both responsible. That's about as far as she would apparently go. I think Joan Kelly felt a little more otherwise. But they said that there was a multifactorial causality. There were many things that could create what we refer to as alienation. They said the alienating behavior of the alienating parent, that's definitely there, no question about it. Then they talked about developmental variation, makes sense. I mean, children process information emotionally, cognitively, intellectually, differently at different ages. The temperament affects that. Same or different sex relationship affects that. All of that does. It makes very good sense. It also talked about the poor parenting of the target parent, that can influence or perhaps make it more difficult or perhaps even be responsible for a good bit of it. Oops. They said the poor parenting could be either too rigid, like a parent could be kind of, I won't say draconian, that's already been used, or too lax, too permissive, and either one of those things could result in the child not being as attached. By the way, a lot of this stuff is not consistent with attachment theory research, which we won't have time to talk about, but there's all kinds of attachments. There's strong insecure and strong secure attachments, and I think that's a very important subset of all this that we won't get into, but I think that shows a very different outcome. And this is what I want you to look at. Isn't that something? This was a chart of causality from an article, and I don't mean to, I apologize to the authors. This is an article entitled Decision Tree, Abuse, Alienation, and/or Estrangement, written by Leslie Droz and Nancy Olson. I had the pleasure of presenting with them at a conference in Boston several years ago, where they were sort of the AFCC bunch, and I realized once I was invited there, I was sort of the Gardner-esque guy, and they were hoping to sort of do something like that, I think, you know. But anyway, but this is a chart that came from an article they wrote in regards to that particular educational process that we went through. But I want to point out a couple things. Look where alienating is on the chart. Okay, these are three causal things to explore, three hypotheses. Okay, alienating is there. Now, it's under poor parenting. Look where it should be. Isn't alienating behavior abusive? That to me is significant. I mean, I think what they did, and I believe probably without even maybe realizing it, I think they sort of sent a worm into the software. It sort of created a different outcome in terms of, well, we'll get to that. I'm getting ahead of myself here. So what? So what if it's over there? Who cares? Well, this is what happens. The role of the alienating behavior in terms of the causality really gets diminished. If anything, it's made as a co-equal component, which means the behavior of the target parent is of equal toxicity. So now the imperfections of parenting can have an equal effect on the fissure in the relationship, which is inconsistent with what we know about abused children. It's inconsistent with what we know about attachment theory, and on and on and on. But that's really kind of the effect, I believe, that it's had. Now, when we go back to the whole bias thing I was going on and on about, alienation really equals a distortion of reality, doesn't it? When children, a classic alienated child believes all kinds of things that just aren't true. I mean, that little girl that believes she was sexually abused when all her father did was say, honey, you look pretty. She believed she was sexually abused. There was a little boy I did an evaluation on in Minnesota many years ago who believed, and he was 5, so his fantasy mechanisms were kind of in warp speed, that there was a big mechanism that somehow was able to extract him. I mean, it was almost kind of a little bit psychotic, but his belief defied the laws of physics. It couldn't have happened. But it was a belief that he had, and I hope that he doesn't now. But the distortion of reality in alienation cases is important. But unfortunately, I think with the introduction of this reformulation, it moves to the back of the line. And now we see things like, well, the child believes he's afraid. It doesn't matter why. That's his subjective reality. So we ought to take that seriously. So it doesn't matter if they were abused or not? Well, yeah, it does. But he believes he was. I mean, that's the kind of things you will hear, and that's the way you'll see in the reports. So as a consequence, the bias tends to get lost. It's no longer recognized clearly. That's no longer the thing that gets sought out. And I think that becomes a huge, huge problem. So in an effort to understand what makes this work and what would work, let's think about another distortion of reality that's fairly common, and that's the treatment of phobias, specifically simple phobias. A good example of that is the person who is phobic of a bridge. A person who is phobic of a bridge, I've had somebody come in my office years ago and say, Doc, I'm in the Orlando area, and this guy got a job in St. Pete, and there's the land of bridges. And he says, I'm phobic of bridges. You got to do something to make this fear go away. And I said, well, I don't have any magic up my, but I can help you get over the bridges, and that's what's going to make the fear go away. And that's, first of all, a recognition that it's irrational, okay? That it's not really a gorilla, it's a lamp, okay? And then the fact that reveals the fact that there's a bias. Oh, and the person who's phobic of a bridge, oh, I got this thing about bridges. When that person is armed with that insight that I have this thing about bridges, they've separated themselves from it. They're able to step off the screen and experience from a different perspective. Okay? That's essential. If you take a person who's phobic of bridges and you say, and think about this in terms of what this reformulated model does, go, oh, you're afraid of the bridge? Okay. Well, let's get out Google and let's find a way to get you there without going to a bridge. Guess what that does to that person's phobia of the bridge? It absolutely intensifies it. So the recommendations that take seriously the subjective biased perceptions of the child will worsen it. It won't make it better. At least will maintain it at that level, and I believe will worsen it. When, in the case of phobias, what ends up happening is a systematic desensitization. You get the person across the bridge in a gradual way, and then finally they go, oh, it's the bridge thing. And then finally, a month or so later, they come back and they call you and say, well, I went across a bridge. I didn't even think about it. That may take a while, but it's because their unconscious saw that the thing didn't cave in, and the first time, the 5th time, and the 100th time. And so they began to become acclimated to it. I realized that was really a lamp about the 5th time I turned the light on. So then I'd start to almost laugh at it when I'd wake up and see the lamp gorilla. It became more of a lamp than a gorilla. But I had to understand that there was a bias, that my perceptions were inaccurate, and that was okay, because that's how we're wired. Okay. So what do we do with bias? If we're all hopelessly biased, what in the world can we do to deal with this and get along in the world? And this is I'll just read it to you. This is a quote by R.D. Laing, the famous, genius, very eccentric British psychiatrist who's no longer with us. But he wrote all kinds. Anybody know, are you familiar with R.D. Laing at all? Yeah? The range of what we think and do is limited by what we fail to notice. And because we fail to notice that we fail to notice, there is little we can do to change until we notice how failing to notice shapes our thoughts and our deeds. So the paradox is we recognize that I might be wrong. Oh, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Let me check. Don't know. I better decide what I think. I have to judge the tree by its fruit and not from what somebody told me the fruit was going to taste like, but I need to bite into it myself and come up with an understanding and an experience of that. Critical thinking, that kind of thing. But I have to recognize that I'm prone to bias, I'm prone to getting it wrong, and if I have a strong belief about something that doesn't fit with reality, I need to be able to step off the screen and look at it, just like the person who's phobic of bridges is able to do. So, you can see where I'm going here, can't you? Well, I'm not really sure where I'm going, so. The first part that we look for an ingredient, what my hope was to be able to develop, sort of grind down a lens from this so that you can look through it and see if what's being proposed as a remedy to your case or your family or whatever has a breath of a chance to succeed. And I think there are ingredients, and this is just the world according to me, so this is not validated. This is a theoretical kind of perspective, but it's one that I think might be useful that I would just offer up, but that's for you to decide. But I think the first thing, does the treatment regimen reveal the fact that there's bias? Does it teach the child to go, well, I don't know, what do you think? Or does it just go, oh, I'm so sorry you're frightened by that lamp, gorilla. Oh, that bridge sure looks scary. I wouldn't want to go over it either. You really look scared when you're thinking about going across that bridge. And that's as far as it goes. And they never cross the bridge. They never turn the lamp on. So that doesn't reveal the bias, does it? It just simply reinforces it, tacitly, but nonetheless reinforces it. I think one of the things that we've seen also is because of the trauma of alienation, I've made mistakes in dealing with alienated children where I have tried to point out that something was not as they thought, that it was a different, made that mistake before, and immediately you get a pushback from the kid. They disconnect from you. They don't want to hear it. They are re-traumatized by the counter-alienation, which is how they experience it. So you have to find some way to get them to look at the bias without blaming the alienating parent. That's very important. It's hard to do, but it's very important. And I think also probably by modeling, you have to stress individuation. What do you think? And why do you think that? And so forth. Not in a confrontational way, in a very calm, stress-free way, in a light way, almost in a superficial way, I would say. I think you have to work with these kids in that way that is light and even has humor in it. Because these kids are been dealt with in such a heavy kind of way that they get re-traumatized by that. So I believe that's the prescription for whatever the kind of ingredients that will be used in a treatment model. I believe will have those qualities if they are to be successful. Did I start on time? Am I supposed to stop at 9? I may go. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. Nope, can't do that. Stress calm and rational analysis and humor. Be able to, what I have found is that in dealing with children that have this, is being able to deal in a parallel way, almost like stories. I mentioned stories earlier, but I didn't really follow that up. By telling stories, it's an old therapeutic trick about sort of making up a story that has sort of moments of like there's a template of their life, but not too clearly a template. And those are ways for a child to experience something, or an adult, to experience something differently without having to commit to a perspective. So things like that. The current strategies of treatment, outpatient therapy, which we now think of as reunification, quite like that is a mixed bag. Reunification is the therapy is the most commonly recommended by courts, and is the most commonly failed by courts. Because typically what happens, it'll be a weekly kind of therapy, 1 hour a week, but usually the first thing that happens is the appointments aren't kept. That's a big deal. If you can show me one court-ordered thing with therapy where actually the appointments are kept, I'd be shocked. I've never seen one. So that's the first thing, just to make it happen. Okay, if you have a child who is significantly alienated and they're in an outpatient therapy, what actually ends up happening is, even if the therapist really understands what's going on and doesn't fall into reinforcing the alienation, the child will end up probably disconnecting from him. It's a very difficult balance to maintain. And then go back for the other how many ever hours in the week there are where all that's getting unhooked by the alienating parent. What happens very often is the therapist gets sucked into it, and they will begin to believe that and go back, I don't think this is really alien. I think this is something. I think something really happened. And then you're back to square one. That happens all the time. When reunification therapy works, it's rare, and the alienation probably isn't very bad. And it takes a really good therapist who understands this very well and is able to maintain a balance of connection without validating, and that's tough. Mention was made of the family workshop. This refers to the program designed by Randy and Deirdre Rand and Richard Warshak. It's sort of a mobile program that is based in getting children to, very directly getting children to think independently, for lack of a better way of putting it. But it's a brief but non-intensive kind of workshop. That's really the right word. It's almost kind of playful, where there are participatory games, all kinds of DVD presentations that are selected by age appropriateness and so forth, that just basically teach a child how, that have nothing to do with their family, nothing to do with their mother or father, but just show how this can happen. I'll tell you one. Randy sent me one, and I'll tell you, so he may not want me to, but I'll tell you anyway. It's okay. He's got a million of these things. There were the DVD starts, and you see three teenagers in like a hallway, and they've got a basketball, and they're throwing the basketball, doom, 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 like that. And the person who's looking at this is supposed to count, and you're told, now count how many times the basketball is thrown. They're really watching, count how many times the basketball is thrown. What ends up happening is, in the midst of the basketball being thrown, a man in a gorilla suit walks out and stands in the middle of the circle, stands there for a minute, and then walks off. And you know how many people see the gorilla the first time if they have no warning? It's very, very low. Now that I've told you that, you all know what to look for if you see that, of course. But I mean, it shows, and that's just the kind of thing that is not threatening, but it really is lifting, isn't it? It shows how we are very capable of misperception. And there's hundreds of these things like that. And so little by little, as these children are exposed to this, they begin to connect the dots. But if they ever say anything, whoa, gee, my dad, begin to turn on the alienating parent, they're directed not to. Oh, no, it's okay. Don't worry about it. Nobody's perfect. So I think it has to maintain that. So that's just a sort of a quick and dirty summary of the family workshop. I'm not going to attempt to, and the Rachel Foundation is a very successful program, Rachel House, and I don't know where Pamela is. Oh, there she is back there, under the lights there. But they boast a very high success rate. The Family Workshop does as well, and these are very credible reports, I believe. And I'll let, if the ingredients that I tried to identify, I believe they are probably represented in what happens in the Rachel House. But we'll see. Maybe, maybe not. There's a new program that's just in its second week now. It's called Breaking Barriers, and it is done by 3 people who are part of the Reformulator group. It's just really my term, but it's Robin Deutsch, who is the president of the AFCC this year, I believe, Matthew Sullivan, who's a psychologist in San Francisco, and then Peggy Ward, who's a psychologist in Massachusetts. And they had an experimental program last year for 1 week where they had the families, alienated children, and they were originally, as I understand it, were going to have just the targeted parent and the children, but the word got out, and the alienating parent got word of it, wouldn't let the kids get out of the car, so it didn't work. So somehow they engineered another one, but it looks to me like they were probably mild to moderate cases of alienation, and they was successful, I think, depending on how alienated the children were. They're scheduled to do a second one this summer, so we'll see how that works. But the way that works, the parents and the children are separated, and they're talked in a group in terms of different issues that come up. But it really goes out of the way not to, I can't speak to that as clearly because it hasn't been around as long, but I believe that it does tend to make a significant, I think it tends to endorse the reality of the traumatized feelings. That's, I believe, but I can't speak to that with certainty. So, but that's kind of it. That's sort of where we are as far as alienation. I think there's stuff that can be done here. I know Amy Baker's got some stuff going in terms of a workbook for teachers and school systems to be able to really promote critical thinking. I think that's what this is really all about, is being able to do that in a non-threatening way. Because when children do go, when the light bulb does go off, they go, oh, they sort of see what happens and talk to any of the adults who have gone through that, and that the light bulb has come on as adults when they had not as children, really are enlightened by it. It's saddened, it's tragic, but they're nonetheless quite enlightened, and they're really just not vulnerable for it happening again. So, that's not too bad. Finally, well, I've got one more thing. One more thing. In the words of Winston Churchill at the Battle of Britain, never, 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 there's something about this fourth never, give up. Thank you.
Dr. Michael Bonin, another round of applause. Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to introduce once again Dr. Abraham Warrenklein. He's going to introduce our next speaker. Thank you.